There is an institution that is devoted to research in vaccine development and the delivery of vaccines to developing countries. It is the International Vaccine Institute, IVI, the first international organization with its headquarters in Seoul. Dr. Jerome Kim is the Institute's first Korean Director General. He has a distinguished record in HIV research and HIV vaccine development. The International Vaccine Institute is contributing to world health with its research, so let us sit down with Dr. Jerome Kim and learn more about his research and the Institute on Heart to Heart. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Jerome Kim, the first Korean Director General of IVI, the International Vaccine Institute. Hello and welcome to our show. Would you like to say hello to our viewers that are watching?
Thank you for the introduction. I'm Jerome Kim. I'm the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, located here in Seoul.
Thank you once again for joining us. Now, first of all, could you maybe begin by telling us about IVI, the International Vaccine Institute, and its mission, perhaps?
The International Vaccine Institute is actually the first international organization headquartered in Korea. It has 35 signatories and WHO, and its mission is to discover, develop, and deliver safe, effective, and affordable vaccines for global health. IVI and its partners in 29 countries around the world are developing vaccines that are difficult for the usual vaccine companies to develop because there's no commercial incentive.
So what kinds of vaccines does IVI develop? And could you also tell us about some of the organization's achievements?
Yes. So IVI's claim to fame, I think, is its oral cholera vaccine. And I think everyone hears about cholera outbreaks around the world in Yemen, South Sudan. And cholera outbreaks are very scary because, within a few weeks, hundreds of thousands of people can be infected and, thousands will die. The oral cholera vaccine was developed early on with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And IVI transferred that technology from our laboratory to companies. And actually, one of the success stories is that a small Korean company called U Biologics is now the world's largest supplier of oral cholera vaccine. So when you hear about the vaccine for cholera being used somewhere around the world, chances are it came from IVI, and there's a good chance that it was made by U Biologics, which is a Korean company. We also work on a vaccine against a disease called typhoid, and we soon will start a new clinical trial for a vaccine against MERS, which Korea had an outbreak of about 3 years ago.
So, you just mentioned cholera and MERS as well, and I'm sure that many people could have thought for a second, then does that mean that there was no cholera vaccine before? But that's not exactly the case?
So there was a cholera vaccine actually back in the turn of the century. But it was found eventually that it didn't work very well.
Oh, I see.
And so in the 1960s, the WHO decided to remove cholera vaccination from its list of things that could be used to control cholera. There was another vaccine called Dukoral. But it was too expensive and it wasn't made in sufficient quantity to be useful in these big outbreaks. So there was a huge outbreak in Rwanda in the 1990s, and it wasn't available for the Haitian outbreak in 2011. But the beauty of the oral cholera vaccine is that it is easy to give, that you can make a lot of it, and that now Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and WHO maintain a stockpile of cholera vaccine. Actually, it's the cholera vaccine from Sanofi and U Biologics that is now used around the world. And actually, last year, WHO and UNICEF announced a program to end cholera, and vaccines are a key part of that strategy.
Oh, I see. So aside from cholera, there are parts in, for example, Africa, let's say, where, areas that are affected by diseases, and there are still many people that are suffering and dying because they are not able to afford to or just purchase any medication or vaccinations. So what kinds of diseases are actually out there, people suffering from?
That's a great question. The WHO estimates that if we were to just take the vaccines that we have and fully vaccinate everyone who should be vaccinated, an additional 2.5 million lives would be saved every year.
Wow.
So over the period they call the decade of vaccines, that's 25 million lives. But your question is important because it gets to a second point, which is if we look at the diseases, infectious diseases, for which there are no vaccines, so that would include the big three, HIV, TB, and malaria. And we include in other diseases that are very important that kill 400 to 500,000 people a year. 5 million people a year die from those diseases. So over the same period of time, over the same 10-year period, 50 million people will die from diseases for which we're doing research in most cases, but for which no vaccine exists. Some of the things that we would like to work on in the future include a vaccine against a common cause of sore throat. We call it strep throat in the United States. In Korea and in the rest of the developed world, you just take some penicillin pills and you're fine.
Yes.
The problem is that in parts of Africa and South Asia, people aren't treated. And the problem, and the reason the doctor treats you for sore throat is not actually because you're in pain or because you have fever. It's to prevent a very severe complication that destroys your heart valves and causes heart failure. And people don't die immediately, but when they're 20 to 30 years old, when a woman gets pregnant, she begins to experience what we call congestive heart failure. And so the number of deaths annually from group A strep, which is this particular bacteria, is probably in the range of 500,000, but no one is developing a vaccine for it.
Oh, wow.
And so we really think that it's important, and we've begun to advocate with funders like the Wellcome Trust to try to develop a vaccine for group A strep.
So we're talking about developing vaccines, but why aren't let's say some major pharmaceuticals developing vaccines? I mean, there could be many reasons. Is it because they cannot afford to develop these vaccines, or what are some other reasons?
Actually, you've answered part of the question yourself. It's that vaccines are complicated. They depend on a human response to the vaccine. The companies estimate that it costs between $500 million to $1 billion to develop a vaccine. And if you start in the lab and go to the vaccines that are actually licensed, it's only 10% of the vaccines actually make it to licensure. So when they think about the accumulated cost and the risk of developing it, vaccines for developed countries like Korea or the United States or Canada make sense because you can charge enough to recoup those losses. But for vaccines for developing countries where the diseases are found primarily in Africa or South Asia, there isn't as much incentive because those vaccines can only be sold for $1 a dose.
But IVI is developing vaccines and doing research to develop these vaccines that pharmaceuticals aren't. So I'd like to ask how the organization is handling expenses or costs. How is the organization doing it?
So when you have a mission to develop vaccines that no one else will develop for people who don't really have a voice, it's a really great feeling. And I think a lot of the people who work at IVI are motivated by the idea that we're doing something for global health that other companies, other groups don't do or can't do. Our funding comes from several sources. Probably the most important is because we're an international organization like the United Nations, countries become what we call state funders. So our biggest state funder, of course, is Korea, which did an initial proposal to host IVI back in the 1990s. Sweden has been a long-time funder, over a decade. And India just became a funder. So we're really happy to have 3 countries now as state funders. The state funders only provide 1/3 of our budget. The rest of it comes from charitable foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or Samsung Foundation. And again, these are grants to develop specific vaccines. For Gates, it's typhoid and cholera. For Samsung, it's a MERS vaccine.
Children and the poor in developing countries suffer from cholera, typhoid, and other diseases. The International Vaccine Institute, IVI, is a non-profit organization established for developing countries suffering from infectious diseases. Let's hear about the IVI, which is headquartered in Seoul, and its relationship with Korea, from its Director General, Dr. Jerome Kim. So you have mentioned in the beginning of our show that the International Vaccine Institute is the first international organization to be headquartered in Korea. Now, in June of 1994, so under the initiative of the UN Development Program, 6 Asian countries, together with Korea, I guess, competed to set up its headquarters in their countries. So I'd like to ask about the biggest factor in choosing Seoul, Korea, for its headquarters. What was the biggest reason or biggest factor?
I think that the Korean offer was difficult to refuse. The Korean government offered a site at Seoul National University in the Gwanak campus, and also offered to build a building, which was very important, and then offered to pay 30% of the operational cost of the institute. So as we're more successful, the Korean government actually contributes more. And I think the Korean government really would like additional state funders. So if there are ambassadors out there from different countries around the world, IVI would really like the support of other countries, because we think that what we do is very important for global health.
I was just about to ask you how the Korean government is actually helping the organization. Is there anything you'd like to add about how the Korean government is helping? What kind of help or support you're receiving from the Korean government?
So we actually work pretty significantly with 2 ministries. We actually fall under the Ministry of Health and Welfare. And actually, it's been really remarkable because, you know, IVI wants to develop vaccines. The Ministry of Health often has vaccines that it would like to develop for Korea. So an example would be a tuberculosis vaccine. So we actually have a collaboration with the Ministry of Health and Welfare to develop a new concept tuberculosis vaccine. It's still in very early stages, still in the laboratory, not yet in animals, but it's also funded in part by the U.S. government with a grant from the U.S. National Institutes of Health. And so this is an example of governments working together on an important problem. The other thing is that the other ministry is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And, you know, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was instrumental in bringing IVI to Korea and helping set it up because, of course, very few people understood how to set up an international organization. But the Ministry of Foreign Affairs also supports IVI through KOICA, the Korean Overseas International Cooperation Agency. And they right now have funded a large program to do vaccination with oral cholera vaccine in Mozambique. And actually, we just started.
Oh, I see.
So it's very exciting. 180,000 people will be vaccinated. Mozambique is one of those countries that has annual outbreaks of cholera. And so the Korean government, recognizing that, and provided support to start vaccinating, which is really a wonderful thing.
Yes, it's amazing. Dr. Jerome Kim is a recognized leader in HIV research and HIV vaccine development. Since his appointment as the Director General of IVI in 2015, Dr. Kim showed off his leadership skills and has contributed immensely to the development of IVI. We'll now learn more about him and his experiences. I'd like to talk a bit more about you. I mean, you are a recognized leader in HIV research and HIV vaccine development. So are you still working on your research, HIV research at IVI?
So through the work that I did before, I'm still involved in some research. But we don't actually receive funding. It's one of the vaccines that we don't receive funding for. And there are other organizations performing that task. You know, HIV is a problem in Korea. You know, there are 1,000 new cases a year, and a vaccine would be beneficial. It's just a matter of, you know, trying to obtain funding to do that. I think the Asian part of the HIV epidemic is really neglected. It's primarily in men who have sex with men, but we know that there are very large epidemics in China and in Thailand and in the Philippines and in Korea, Japan, Taiwan. But it's a difficult thing to bring up and address. and it would benefit from additional government funding.
So, I mean, you've long been involved in the research on the HIV vaccine with the United States government before even coming to the IVI. I'd like to ask you, what prompted you to begin your HIV research or your work on HIV?
Let's see, I went to medical school a long time ago, actually, and I was there in 1980, and at the end in 1981, so we were just a second-year medical student, this new epidemic was reported in Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, and it was HIV. And so when we finally started seeing patients a year later, we started to see the first cases of HIV. At that time, we couldn't diagnose it early, so these were all people with AIDS, persons with AIDS in New Haven. And then I moved on to Duke, and we didn't see as much HIV in North Carolina as was seen in the Northeast or in San Francisco or Los Angeles. But we did see cases, and it was the great unknown epidemic. At that point, we didn't have diagnostic tests. We didn't really know how to treat it. And it was just one of the great unsolved mysteries, medical mysteries, and it was just really intriguing. And I happened to join a lab that had an expert in HIV, Dr. Warner Green, as its head, and that made it easy. And of course, the Army, the U.S. Army, very early got interested in HIV because they were concerned that it might affect the blood supply. You know, when people are deployed overseas and if there's an emergency, then everybody who's there will just donate blood on the spot. And actually, when I was in Afghanistan, we did that many times. And you want to make sure that what we call the walking blood bank is safe. And so they were very concerned, and they actually started screening the entire military and actually developed a workplace policy for HIV years before anybody in the civilian world did. And you couldn't discriminate against people with HIV. You offered treatment. You prevented their commanding officers from harming them or discriminating against them. It was very important to have that protection in place. So I was actually kind of lucky. And also, all the people who had HIV in the U.S. Army military were enrolled in a program where they were followed sequentially, and we obtained blood from them with their consent. It was a protocol. And it allowed us then to really understand how HIV progressed, and we really were able to see the impact of treatments and other interventions. So early on, there was always an interest, and I was lucky enough to be in the military when the vaccine program was started. And since I was interested in it, and the military was interested in people who were interested in HIV vaccine research, I was very lucky.
Yes, and you're still continuing your HIV research.
Hopefully.
Now, you have traveled to many places around the world: Africa, Thailand, Russia, India, and of course to other parts of the world to meet with patients for your HIV vaccine research. Of all of the patients you've met, is there maybe a story you'd like to share, or is there a patient that you still remember till this day?
You know, probably the one that made me most passionate about HIV vaccines was not actually a patient in a trial, but I was deployed by, at that point, the U.S. Air Force to Guantanamo Bay in the 1990s, when there were about 70,000 Cubans and Haitians who were put there because they were refugees, and they, rather than land them in Florida, they were brought to Guantanamo. And we had to take care of them, and as an infectious disease doctor, Haiti was one of the epicenters of the early HIV outbreak. And we had these kids who were born to HIV-infected mothers who had HIV themselves, and one of them was really cute. His name was Nixon. And I don't know why they named him Nixon, but he had actually been born in Guantanamo Bay and had been sent back to Haiti, and his mother came with him again, and they were caught and brought back to Guantanamo Bay. And he was just the cutest. I have this picture of him with a Coke can, and he was like the happiest because someone had given him a can of Coke. It was really just but you know, in a place like Haiti, or in places in Africa where they don't have access to care, and you know, the access to prevention is also poor, we're going to continue to see infections. And until we have a vaccine or a much more effective prevention, we will continue to have cases. I think they just issued a warning out of the last big HIV meeting that we have to be able to maintain our vigilance, our treatment, our screening. Otherwise, we know that HIV will relapse and it will come back even worse than it was initially. So we still have to fund programs for treatment and programs for prevention. So it's a never-ending fight until we have an effective vaccine.
Yes. From what I've heard, your grandfather is the late Kim Hyun-gul, patriot who took part in the independence movement of South Korea in the United States. So I'd like to ask about your memories with and of your grandfather.
So,
had he told you any stories about the independence movement that you remember?
So I was still very young when he was able to speak. He had a throat cancer and they removed his larynx, so he couldn't speak for the last 5 years of his life. And but I do remember him well because he would take me out to pick up his paycheck, and he would always take me to a store to buy candy. So that's the reason, of course you go with Grandpa because he buys you candy. And but at that point I was, 2 years old or 3 years old, and I didn't really ask many questions. I learned about it actually from my grandmother after my grandfather passed away. And he had written an autobiography. And I remember it because, I learned to read, and he was doing these things on a very thin paper, and it looked like chicken scratch, but he was writing it in Chinese calligraphy.
I see.
And it was so complicated that when the University of Hawaii Korean Studies Center tried to translate it, they actually had to bring someone from Taiwan who could read the calligraphy. So they translated it into English, and they published the book that he had written in English translation. And it's wonderful because the first 2 chapters tell us about our family in English, which is great.
Very interesting. Now, you were appointed Director General of the IVI in March of 2015. And I hear there's news about you staying longer. I'd like to ask about your future plans.
Yeah, so our board just approved another 4 years, so I should be staying through 2023. IVI is a very exciting place to work now. It's, we are growing. We have more and new vaccines. We've started actually working on vaccines using our own funding now that, our generous contributors from Korea, India, and Sweden have given us enough to really begin to work on vaccines that for poverty-associated diseases that other people can't work on because they're not funded to do that. And so I think that's a wonderful thing. We also helped set up a Korean government program which is going to be providing funding for global health, vaccines, diagnostics, and drugs. And hopefully that will be announced publicly soon. And again, these are things where you work with the Korean government, with the Gates Foundation, with companies, and when you see something like that happen, it's really a remarkable circumstance that you've been able to bring together different things. And so it's really a credit to the government and to the people who are now going to launch this to see it. It's kind of like you're a parent and you're watching something grow up and become mature and be successful.
Yes. And finally, I would like to ask you if you have a message you would like to deliver to our viewers that are watching right now, anything you'd like to say as a vaccine expert.
I think, vaccines have come under fire recently, but there isn't a more cost-effective intervention that we can do. For every $1 we spend on vaccines, society receives $44 in benefit. That's a return on investment of 44 to 1. There isn't another investment that a government can make that is more cost beneficial than vaccines. And yet we, in parts of the world, like for instance just recently in Italy, they decided that they were going to revoke some of the previous requirements for vaccination. These kinds of things are really counterproductive to society. I mean, we know vaccines are associated with higher incomes, economic development in countries, IQ. Vaccines have enormous secondary benefits, even outside of their benefits directly on health. And so when countries turn their backs on vaccines or when they succumb to anti-vaccination movements, they're really doing society and their countries a disservice.
I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today. It's wonderful how you are contributing your knowledge and expertise to the development of vaccines at the IVI, International Vaccines Institute, and we hope that you continue for a very long time to help save lives and continue to develop and deploy vaccinations. Thank you so much for your time once again, and yes, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much.